I was involved in a project that had a team of people look at the research around climate change education and what is in the printed literature that tells us about the success of that climate change education program. So we started by doing a very systematic search of the literature, which resulted in about 1,000 papers that are out there, only in English-speaking journals and only in the peer-reviewed literature. So it's not like we're doing a search of everything that exists. It's fairly narrowly defined to begin with. We were looking for articles that described an educational program and evaluated it. We did that search process and narrowed down on only 49 papers in the end. We read all those papers and tried to figure out what they had in common and what themes they were responding to. And that's where these 6 themes came from. Now, none of the papers actually did all 6. So there were some clusters of papers that were similar. And another thing that's important to think about is that most of them were reporting the things teachers did in schools, mostly ages of children from 12 to 18 years. About half of them were from North America. The other half were from everywhere else in the world. They didn't all want to achieve the same thing. The vast majority were increasing knowledge about climate change, but some also added attitudes to that, and some added skills. They wanted to encourage kids to do something and make a difference. So they all weren't measuring the same thing because they all had different goals. Some of our themes are things that we already know make a difference. And that's not at all surprising, but I think it's good to recognize that, yes, we know these things are good to do, and the literature confirms that. So 2 of them are in that camp. One is that education needs to be personally meaningful and relevant to the students. And yes, any educator knows that. That's how you get kids' attention. That's how they continue to pay attention to the program. That's what gets them interested and involved. But it could be a little tricky to make climate change personally relevant. If they can't see it, if they don't have evidence of it, if it's somewhere else that it's happening. And so the papers that we read, from which we determined this theme of personally relevant, were able to do that. They looked at the impacts of climate change on those communities where kids lived. Maybe it has to do with the range of wildlife or invasive exotic plants. Maybe it has to do with rainfall, precipitation, water quantity projections. Maybe it has to do with temperature. Maybe it has to do with their energy consumption. Lots of different ways teachers found to make climate change relevant to those kids. Sometimes the students collected data in their community, and sometimes they took action in their community. Those were also relevant. So it wasn't just the information they were learning, but how they were engaged in the program. The second category is exactly that, engaging learners. So good education is active, it's experiential, it's inquiry-based, it's student-centered. And teachers had a wide variety of strategies they used to do that. Sometimes it was debates, sometimes it was small group discussions and worksheets. Sometimes it was a hands-on laboratory or a field trip to somewhere in their community. Maybe they brought in a guest speaker and they interacted with that person. They did role plays, they did simulations. So it doesn't have to be watching a movie and finding out what somebody else did at the North Pole. It can be home, it can be local, and it can be engaging kids with questions and interaction. A third theme probably will resonate with science educators, and they will probably say, oh yeah, that's true, we know that too. And that is science education where kids can interact with scientists, collect their own data, analyze their data or some scientist data, and use that data to make some hypotheses or test some hypotheses. That's the scientific process. The activity of doing science is our third category. And those are all strategies that teachers use to successfully convey climate science. If the teachers were working with a scientist, a real life scientist in their community, that interaction also increased teachers' confidence to teach about climate change. And I think that had spillover with the students as well. So the activity of using real data, even if it wasn't their own data, they could download databases from the internet and learn how to use GIS, and say, oh, this is what it looks like in that other place somewhere else in the world. And those scientists are doing this work, and I can analyze their data right along with them. That was exciting for kids. Our fourth theme might resonate stronger with social studies and geography teachers. And that is a strategy of using deliberative discussion, thinking about different perspectives, how different stakeholders respond to an issue, why different people have different ideas about climate change, and what we should do about it. That notion of exploring what I think, where I got that information, and how other people got information and what they think, and that interaction back and forth. That was incredibly valuable. And teachers found that as several different ways to make climate change alive and real and meaningful to kids. Some of the authors called it the art of argumentation. And I think there's some skills there that are very helpful. I think when kids learn debate strategies, they're practicing synthesizing information and thinking critically about why they believe that to be true, who might have a problem with it, how they would counter that information. So they just spend more time thinking about what they know and how they know it and how they can convey that information to others. One particular paper had students doing something very similar. I think it was in Germany. And they actually reported a negative outcome. They said, well, it didn't work. And they believed because all the students had a very similar perspective. They weren't bringing diversity into the classroom. And so that's a useful thing to think about. And it might be that teachers need to use the newspapers or have other people represent positions. Role plays and simulations may work. So it's that diversity of opinion that helped students learn more about what they know and why they know it. And that leads us to the remaining two themes that I think are not brand new to educators, but they're not commonly done for many different reasons. One is addressing misconceptions. Climate change is full of scientific misconceptions. People can easily get the wrong idea in their head, and it's hard to let that go. And as a result, they then either find information or remember information that confirms their initial biases, and they're less open to understanding new ideas. So that whole world of how we go about counteracting and decommissioning misconceptions is tricky to do, but that was a fifth category and a fifth theme. I think it's really hard for educators to do that work unless they're really well-versed in the science itself. It takes a strong background in the science to be able to see a misconception, to ask the right questions, to have people reveal, oh, well, I thought this was happening. And then work through the process of, well, if that were true, what evidence would I see? There was one delightful story, I think it was in Italy, where teachers asked students what they think might be causing global warming. And somebody said, well, volcanoes. The earth is hot, and so there must be more volcanoes, and that's why the temperature is heating up. And so again, the questioning process, what would we see? What evidence would we need to support that line of reasoning? And they thought, well, more volcanic activity would be part of what you would see if that were true. And that's something that you can find data on. And so the kids can go explore. Have there been more volcanoes in the last 10 years than there were in the previous 10 or 10 years, 100 years ago. And no, there's actually been less volcanic activity. So the kids were able to realize maybe that's not true. So they can counteract their own misconceptions. And again, that takes skill, that takes talent to make that happen. So that brings us to the last theme, number 6. And that is this notion of project-based learning, doing projects from the classroom. Now, those projects could be within the school. That could be kids making a videotape, or teaching their parents, or running a program to make information more available to others, like younger students. Those are projects. And then when they had to do with climate change, the students were learning by creating the project, the program, doing the education itself. There were also papers where teachers and students did projects in the community. They were interacting with community experts. They were planting trees, collecting data, talking to landowners, working with municipalities to think about sea level rise, what was happening along the coast. Some of them were doing energy conservation activities in their school or in their homes. Just lots of different kinds of projects that were associated with climate change and energy consumption. Those activities built efficacy, they built problem-solving skills, they generated hope. They helped kids think, there's something I can do. And in fact, everybody can do these things. And it's not such a gloom and doom forecast with climate change. I mean, it's serious and it's a problem, but hey, there's things we can do about it. So those are the 6 themes we came up with. They may not include every good idea that's out there. They may be broad enough to be umbrellas under which many things could fall. The papers that we read to come up with these themes were mostly published between 2010 and 2016. I think the general public has a different notion of climate change than we did 5 years ago. And students certainly have a different sense of the urgency about climate change and their willingness to do something about it. So we might see more project-based learning happening now, and that would be great, because I think that's an activity that can actually encompass many of these other themes. If students are doing a project in their community, it's interesting, it's meaningful, it's relevant, they're collecting data, they're interacting with scientists or community members, and many of these themes all relate to the same activity.